Good morning, everyone. My name is LP Champagne. I'm the Associate Vice President for Public Affairs and Industry Practices at the CCA. Today is our pre-briefing for the economic report of April 2026. We are quite excited to introduce this new document to the public next week. This is an important report that we publish now quarterly to give a snapshot of the health of the construction sector. And we believe that this specific report is paramount considering the geopolitical tension that we see, especially in the Persian Gulf and the impact on our supply chain through oil price. Joining me today is our economist, Young-Han Liu. He goes by Max. Max will be presenting the report over a few slides and a PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll have some time at the end for question that I'll be moderating. I see some 50-some people joining us here on the call, so please keep in mind that this call is recorded and will be posted on YouTube after the fact. If you're not comfortable being on camera or being recorded, please make sure to keep your camera closed and your microphone muted. Throughout the presentation, please keep your mic muted regardless. And if you have a question, use the raise hand function and we'll address you. So without further ado, let's turn to Max with the report.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, so yeah, welcome to the spring 2026 edition of our Economic Insight. Per usual, we start with an overview of the state of the Canadian economy and the construction industry. In the last quarter of 2025, Canada's real GDP contracted by 0.6% annualized, driven almost entirely by inventory drawdowns. Inventory accumulation had already slowed in the third quarter after the stocking up in the first half of 2025. And in Q4, the change in inventory level turned negative as firms worked through earlier stockpiles. To put another way, back in the third quarter, firms were still accumulating more inventory, but at a reduced pace compared to Q2 after the tariffs solidified. By Q4, sales or use of existing stock exceeded the new additions. The same inventories that touched up the numbers earlier in 2025 are now making the headline look worse than the underlying economy. Other components, including net exports, household consumption, and capital investment, all posted gains, albeit at a modest pace. While the details look firmer than aggregate decline suggests, domestic demand growth remains moderate compared to its historic average. Construction sector GDP declined by 0.6% on a quarterly basis, following 6 consecutive quarterly increases. Despite the pullback, real construction GDP remained elevated at 171 billion, and the sector's share of total industry GDP held steady at 7.3%. We've been calling the industry more resilient to shocks from the US tariffs, and this is the first time that construction sector GDP growth fell behind the all-industry average since the first quarter of 2025. The main contributor of the dip was engineering and other construction activities, which fell by 1.4% after really strong growth in the third quarter. In 2025, the subsector increased by almost 4% over the sum of 2024. Residential building construction also declined, while non-residential building construction recovered. That translates to an annual increase of around 2% for both subsectors. All in all, engineering construction has gained momentum in 2025 as non-residential building construction slowed, and annually the industry's growth rate was positive, up by 2.3% compared to 1.6% of the all-industry average. In the last quarter of 2025, Canada's recorded $64 billion in investment in building construction, up 1.3% from previous quarters, and that's also 6% higher year over year. Rate cuts in September and October led to the first quarterly gain since the first quarter in 2025. The largest contributor to this gain was multiple dwelling buildings subcategory, accounting for most of the total increase. It is expected that investment in multiple dwelling buildings will moderate through 2026, particularly in Ontario and BC. Investment in commercial buildings rose by 2.3% over the third quarter, but still down by 1.5% year over year. The subcategory has been soft since COVID. Industrial building construction dropped further, which is 14% lower now than a year ago. The slowdown in manufacturing and increasing cost of steel both led to the lower demand for factories and warehouse buildings. Looking back at 2025, we saw a healthy increase in total investment. Total value is up 5% annually, and provincially, 8 out of 13 provinces and territories recorded quarterly increases, with 10 reporting annual increases. Ontario remained soft in the fourth quarter, while Quebec was at the upper end, posting consecutive gains in 2025, resulting in an annual increase of 13%. Despite a rebound in the last quarter of 2025, total permits value of the year finished 2.5% below the 2024 levels. The largest drag came from single-family dwellings, which accounted for 2 percentage points of the overall 2.5% decline, and multiple dwelling buildings subtracted another percentage point on top of that. In 2025, Canada's population fell by more than 100,000, led by Ontario and BC provincially. This led to softer rental markets, weaker investor appetite, and just less attractive economics in general for new condos in Toronto and Vancouver. Industrial building permits fell 20% year over year, which is similar to the decline that we saw back with the investment in building construction chart. Pulling in the positive direction, institutional and governmental buildings rose by almost 2%, and commercial buildings increased by 2.7% relative to 2024. The bar for the first quarter of 2026 represents the average of the January and February data, and for the moment being, it's still holding up. Now let's move on to the quarterly focus section of this quarter's report, which focuses on the provincial budget and the recent trends that were mentioned and shared among the provinces that's shifting public sector construction. So here we have 8 provinces that released budgets for the fiscal year of 2026 and 27 as of when this chart was being prepared. Comparing these with projections and assumptions made in last year's provincial budgets, fiscal health generally appeared weaker than previously expected. The broad story is that expense revisions dominate revenue revisions. So the worsening in fiscal deficit is due to the increased expenditure rather than reduced revenue. Now, on the chart on the left, we can see that New Brunswick shows the sharpest deterioration. Its deficit to GDP forecast worsened from negative 0.9% to now negative 2.7%, while revenue was essentially unchanged and expenses were revised up by 6.4%. Alberta also saw a significant decline, with its deficit to GDP moving from negative 0.5% to negative 1.9%. Notably, Alberta is the only province in the group to report a large revenue downgrade. Due to the recent volatility in oil prices, the actual deficit will see meaningful reduction, but the scale will depend on how long the oil shock persists, and the same applies to Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador as well. Nova Scotia and British Columbia also experienced notable deterioration, while Quebec is the outlier here on the positive end. Its deficit to GDP ratio actually improved slightly, and it is also the only province that experienced a reduction in debt to GDP ratio. For these 8 provinces, the total revenue was estimated to be 0.4% higher than previously projected, and expense is 3.2% higher. So deficit to GDP ratio will worsen from an average of 0.7% to 1.3%. Now, each province has their own specific drivers behind the changes. Some reflect major accounting revisions, most notably the tobacco settlement adjustment in DC. Others stem from weaker commodity prices affecting key exports. But we found three common issues and risks that are shared among the provinces. So the biggest single risk facing Canada right now is international trade, and more specifically, the CUSMA review. CUSMA creates both upside and downside risk. A clean extension would reduce uncertainty and could ease tariff-related cost pressure on key construction inputs. But for now, trade risk is already showing up in costs through direct tariffs, insurance, and contingencies. The review is underway, but it is moving slowly. A full agreement won't be reached by the July 1st review date. Though that does not mean CUSMA collapse, it will just move to annual review instead of a 14-year extension until a deal is reached. Canada and the US are still in bilateral discussions, while Mexico has moved further onto trilateral matters with the US and has set a time for their formal talks to begin on the week of May 25th. The most politically charged sectors for all three countries are around steel, aluminum, and autos. For Canada, the US is also pressing on dairy, liquor, and government procurement. The US is trying to fold its own national security objectives into the review, meaning stricter North American content rules, more screening on foreign investment for both Canada and Mexico, closer alignment on tariffs against the rest of the world, and greater insulation from Asian countries like China. Canada is offering deals on energy and critical minerals in the discussions, but so far those offers haven't gained enough traction to secure relief on the US tariffs affecting steel, aluminum, and autos. Prime Minister Carney has been pushing Canada to diversify away from the US. The American asks that we just talked about are actually counterproductive to that effort. And as such, the negotiations walk a very fine line between securing short-term tariff relief and preserving Canada's long-term room to maneuver. The second issue that we are going to talk about is population outflow. Now, population growth has slowed more sharply than expected as federal immigration restraint begins to reflect in the data. On a national account consistent basis, Canada's population declined in Q4 2025, marking that the first quarter in which population subtracted from year-over-year GDP growth since the per capita series began in the 1980s. The slowdown is already weighing on headline GDP and labor force growth. Since 2022, much of Canada's aggregate GDP growth has came from the population gains rather than stronger output per person. As you can hardly see any teal-colored area in the positive territory on this chart. Over 2025, Canada's population declined by more than 100,000, or 0.25% of the entire population. That's a weaker outcome than anticipated in most earlier forecasts. The pullback was concentrated in provinces that had seen the largest earlier inflows, particularly Ontario and British Columbia, with both provinces recording population decline of more than 0.7%. Much of the adjustment came from the reduction in non-permanent residents, whose numbers fell by 460,000 over the year, or 15% of what they were a year ago nationally. Ontario alone accounted for more than half of that decline in non-permanent residents. And narrower pathways to permanent residency, softer labor market conditions, and reduced international student inflow appears to have contributed to both fewer arrivals and more departures. Natural disasters, particularly wildfires, are likely to become a more prominent theme as Canada enters the summer season. Several provinces reported higher than expected damage to infrastructure due to natural disasters last year. Provinces are allocating additional funds to rebuild and protect the infrastructure, and also more contingency funds to manage future risks. So now to the weather report. Canada appears set for a slower start to the 2026 wildfire season. Snow covers across parts of the northern Canada and some parts of western Canada, which delays the fire season. But by May and June, warmer than normal temperature and drying fuels on the ground could bring more frequent and larger fires in the Thousand Regions and areas around James Bay and Hudson Bay. For the construction industry, natural disasters affect both project delivery and cost. Extreme weather events can disrupt work schedule, delay project timelines, and increase uncertainty around labor availability and site access. In addition, repeated disaster activity has contributed to rising insurance costs, adding to overhead pressure along with broader geopolitical and market-driven risks. Together, these factors reinforce the role of climate-related events as a growing source of cost volatility and planning risk for the construction industry. Now, the war involving Iran has become impossible to ignore. Most people have also become familiar, perhaps for the first time, with the Strait of Hormuz. Update comes in every minute. Oil prices have risen, ceasefire headlines have come and gone. It's easy to lose track of what's actually happening. So we're going to take a look at where the situation stands now and what it means for the Canadian economy and the construction industry. The direct effect on energy prices and crude oil prices is like a live transcript of the crisis. Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th, when one day after that, the Ayatollah was announced dead. It was around that time when ships stopped passing through the strait. On March 18th, Iran struck Qatar's Ras Laffan hub, knocking out 17% of Qatar's LNG capacity, and Gulf export infrastructure had become direct targets of Iran. And fears pushed global seaborne oil prices up. Most Middle Eastern oil reaches the world by sea and is priced more closely off Brent than the WTI. So when the Gulf exports are threatened, Brent rose faster, and risk shows up in the wider spread between Brent and the WTI. Oil prices reached its peak when President Trump posted on Truth Social that a whole civilization will die tonight, and Brent went above $130 per barrel, and WTI above $110, and that was before the April 8th deadline. So since then, prices have moderated significantly, but are still up by more than 50% compared to what they were before the war. Before the war, the Strait of Hormuz trafficked about a quarter of global seaborne oil trade, and an average of 140 ships passed the strait daily. The tankers inside the Gulf stored more than 50 million barrels of crude on the sea. As of mid-April, more than 120 million barrels of crude and roughly 46 million barrels of refined oil are floating on about 260 tankers in the Gulf, plus another 1.2 million tons of LNG. The ceasefire since April 8th allowed some relief. You can see the chart on the right shows a reduction, but the strait remains effectively closed as of now. Because barrels are no longer moving out by sea, storage is filling up, producers are forced to shut in production. A recent IEA report suggests that disruption has already reduced Gulf producer output by more than 14 million barrels per day, which is more than half of the pre-war supply. The WTI curve shows that the oil shock is heavily front-loaded. Near-term contracts are carrying the largest premium, which means the squeeze is concentrated in immediate physical availability, especially at the loading docks and refineries. As of April 15th, WTI futures expiring in June were priced around $90 a barrel, while contracts expiring around mid-2028 were closer to $70. So markets see the shock as acute but not permanent. When stranded barrels are released, immediate pressure will ease, pulling spot and near-term prices lower. Dr. Les Killian from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas projected oil prices under 3 scenarios based on how long the closure lasts. A cessation of oil exports from the Persian Gulf that lasts 1 quarter would raise WTI price to around $110 per barrel by May 2026. An outage lasting 2 quarters would cause the WTI price to peak at $132 per barrel by August, and the outage lasting 3 quarters would cause the WTI price to peak at $167 in November. Taking into consideration the path of oil and gasoline prices in each scenario, the model predicts that closing Strait of Hormuz for 1, 2, and 3 quarters would increase U.S. inflation in Q4 2026 by around 0.3, 0.8, and 1.5 percentage points respectively. The corresponding effect on U.S. core inflation would only exceed 0.5 percentage points if the closure persists for longer than 2 quarters. So these projections suggest the Federal Reserve could look through the shock without steering away from the iceberg if the closure is resolved before around September and inflation expectations remain anchored. The Bank of Canada faces a similar stretch of water. How visible is that shock in Canada's inflation numbers? So far, the direct increase in prices at the pumps and for transportation pushed inflation up from 1.8% in February to 2.4% in March, but core CPI continues to trend downwards. So thus, the inflationary effects have not spread to categories beyond oil, fertilizers, and other petrochemicals. Currently, inflation is low. The challenge is that it has not stayed low long enough to re-anchor expectations. And after several years of rising prices, households haven't had enough time to feel convinced that price stability is back. Compared to the almost unanimous sentiment to maintain interest rate until 2027, economists are now more hawkish about a rate hike. Rates are expected to stay put tomorrow and through the 3rd quarter, but outlook a year from now is 25 basis points higher compared to projected last quarter. The oil shock weighs on global growth. The IMF cuts its 2026 world GDP forecast from 3.3% to 3.1%. However, the case for Canada is a bit different. Historically, oil shocks boost the Canadian economy, employment, and housing prices. A variance decomposition shows that real oil price shocks account for about 11% of variability in the growth rate in real house prices. Its impact on inflation will be more temporary. A single month increase will only hike inflation for less than 3 months. An increase in the real price of oil raises real house prices, building permits, and housing starts. Although the improvement of these outcomes in oil-rich regions tend to increase the most, the authors have also found that in cities and provinces where oil industry is non-existent, the effect remains positive. And why is that? Mostly due to 2 reasons. One is the equalization payments will help spill over the oil wealth and redistribute income across provinces. The other is interprovincial trade. Stronger demand from these regions will lift jobs and housing demand through supply chains and consumer spending in the rest of the country. They also show that there's no sign of interprovincial night migration towards the oil-rich provinces historically. However, the war in Iran is more than just the increase in oil prices. The geopolitical aspect poses major unpredictable risks. Oil revenue may rise, but they may not translate into further investment in oil like it used to. Global demand for oil is expected to peak near the end of this decade. Producers have less incentive to expand capacity, so that makes job creation less automatic than in past oil booms. Just this morning, the UAE announced their decision to quit OPEC, so that can raise its production in the years to come, which is bearish on medium to long-term oil prices, and it weakens the case to further investment in Canada. Overall, oil shock is best viewed as a mixed shock, but not an ambiguous gain or loss. For construction, the impact goes beyond transportation cost. Higher oil prices raise diesel cost for on-site operations and cost of petroleum-based building materials. Key exposed inputs include bitumen, piping, roofing membranes, insulation, and adhesives. Energy-intensive products such as cement, flat glass, and aluminum also face higher production costs. So increase in freight prices so far has been moderate, but insurance costs may go up. In short, the energy shock can broaden into wide construction cost pressure. Our next topic will be the obstacles faced by the construction businesses. Over the course of 2025, 40% of construction businesses reported a negative impact from the US tariffs on goods sold in Canada, while 33% reported a negative impact from Canadian tariffs on goods purchased from the US. Actions to eliminate the interprovincial trade barriers have been rather insignificant so far. More than 2/3 of construction firms experienced cost increases due to tariffs. Construction businesses are not delaying Canadian investment or expansion plans the same way that the manufacturers are. Only about less than 2% of construction firms have delayed their plans versus almost 10% of manufacturers have halted their plan to expand. The survey also finds that 10% of construction companies were forced to change their suppliers as a result of the trade disruptions. Construction business expectations were largely unchanged at the start of 2026 compared to the end of 2025. Only 18% of firms reported that they expected no significant obstacle in the first quarter. Among the 10 most frequently cited obstacles, inflation remained the top concern, shared by almost half of all construction businesses. Recruiting skilled employees has become the second largest concern, increasing by 2.4 percentage points from the last quarter to 36%. Consistent with the sign of tightening labor market conditions, labor force shortages were cited by almost 30% of firms as well. Sorted by net change, the cost of insurance saw largest decline, with 12% fewer firms expecting higher insurance cost. The survey was conducted back in January, so we'll likely see a comeback of this problem in the next quarter. Costs related to real estate, leasing, and property taxes were cited by 4% more firms, while concerns over fluctuation in consumer demand rose by 3.5 percentage points. Provincially, firms in New Brunswick and Ontario are most likely to cite cost-related obstacles, with almost 80% of firms reporting so. Quebec recorded the largest quarterly increase in cost concern, with 20% more firms citing cost pressures. Labor-related obstacles were most acute in Quebec and New Brunswick, with more than 60% of firms citing them, while Alberta and the rest of Atlantic provinces reported lower labor-related concerns at about 30%. 70% of construction firms reported that they were either somewhat or very optimistic over the next 12 months. Newfoundland and Labrador, BC, and Quebec were among the most optimistic, while Alberta, New Brunswick, and Ontario were less so. Moving on to labor market conditions. The number of payroll employees in Canada increased by 0.6% in Q4 compared to Q3. 8 out of 13 provinces and territories posted gains, with Quebec, Saskatchewan leading the growth. Quebec added nearly 5,000 payroll employees, equivalent to a 2% increase over the 3-month period, and that's driving the first materially significant national gain in the past year. Saskatchewan added more than 1,000 jobs from the third quarter, equivalent to a 3.5% increase. At the subsector level, building equipment contractors contributed the most to overall growth. Highway, street, and bridge construction posted the strongest quarterly increase. At the same time, land subdivision employment fell by another 2%, reaching its lowest level since 2021, continuing the downward trend since the pandemic. Year over year, construction payroll employment was essentially flat, but its composition shifted slightly beneath the surface. Share of non-residential building construction and building equipment contractors each rose by 0.3%, while utility system construction and residential building each declined by 0.2 percentage points. Among the categories, land subdivision fell the most annually as well, down by 8%, while other heavy and civil engineering construction posted the strongest annual increase at 4%. Vacancy levels have remained stable and above pre-COVID average. However, labor force is shrinking due to both retirements and tightening in immigration. In Q4, there was 12% less job seekers in the construction industry compared to third quarter of 2025. As a result, it has become more difficult to hire compared to the levels in mid-2025. On average, there were about 2.4 applicants per job posting, compared to during mid-2025 when it was at about 3 applicants per posting. Finally, let's look at what's happening on the cost front. Cost of building construction increased by 4.1% year over year in the last quarter of 2025, which remains elevated. Every quarter, at least for the past year or so, these numbers get revised higher by the time the next quarter's number come out. The data shows a split on the lower end. The divisions that have lower increase below average, we see that inflation is actually slowing. But on the higher end, we see drivers like structural steel framing and metal fabrications keep rising further at above 10%. And they're pulling the overall cost up. And we'll likely continue to observe changes in these categories in the next quarter. What does that translate to in terms of building costs in regions and building types? Cost of construction is rising the most for factory buildings. This hinders our ability to expand the manufacturing sector. This also means regions like London, with a high structural steel mix in their vertical construction, faces the steepest average cost increases, whereas other cities such as Quebec is seeing broad increases among the divisions rather than a composition issue. We have mentioned many downside risks today, but having risk is not the same thing as a recession. Construction is still adapting to the changing trade and procurement rules. The geopolitical risk is pushing costs higher through energy, transportation, and materials. Uncertainty continues to weigh on investment decisions. Demand may be low for condo buildings, but that is partly offset by stronger activity in purpose-built rentals. And major projects will add to the pipeline for heavy and civil construction. The risk factors are many, but impact of risks, such as the oil shock, can be mixed, and the industry as a whole is still cautiously optimistic. That concludes my presentation for today, and I'm happy to take on any questions.
Thank you, Max. As always, it's very insightful and a great opportunity to look at the reality of the market that we are part of. We have some time for question. We have almost 20 minutes. I'll be happy to give you some time back if we don't fill this up, but I would recommend that anybody with questions on the info presented or anything related to it, just use the raise hand function. I'll recognize you so you can ask your question, starting with Mike Carter from London.
Good morning, Max. Good morning, LP. A quick question for you on CUSMA and where that may go. Is there any sense that the crazy Trump people will implement export controls over, say, petroleum-based products that are pretty much exclusive to Texas to harm Canada? As sort of, you get rid of our bourbon, we'll get rid of all of your PEX pipe.
Right. That's not something that I've heard about so far around the discussions, and I would say that's probably very unlikely at this moment, at the very least. And he's been saying that other countries should, in fact, buy more oil from the U.S. So yeah, I would say that's not the most likely for the moment.
And I would add to this, I think the most likely reality in the next few months when it comes to the CUSMA review will be more activity around what we already heard, right? So for the last few months, couple of months now, the focus of the Trump administration have been away from Canada. We haven't heard much about the 51st states or even tariff as a whole because they're so focused on the situation in the Persian Gulf. CUSMA review will likely re-trigger some of those outbursts regarding Canada. So we could see changes, probably more in terms of tariff towards Canada. We could see a discussion taking place about some of these long tension that we have with the US on lumber exports, on dairy in Quebec specifically, or specifically in my case, I think we'll hear some more about the impact of Buy Canadian policy. This is a policy put in place by Canada to protect our manufacturing sector and promote the use of Canadian goods. This is a sore point for the American that says, hey, why don't you want to buy American? So I think we'll see some discussion on that, and we could see out of the CUSMA review some radical changes in the way we trade with the US, positive or negative. So more is to be seen, but at this point, it's all speculation, of course. I see Eric Cote is on the screen. You have a question, Eric?
Yes, we haven't heard from the discussion with Madame Fréchette and James Greer from yesterday. So probably this will filter out later on, or she hasn't spoken about the meeting she had with the commerce responsible for commerce. But I wasn't worried, and I saw the you can tell us the price of gas of petroleum going really up to 156. I saw the backlash effect on produce. We had a conference this week. They say it's up to 8 months, but I've seen the data in the States is got like more like immediately, and I think the IPPI is starting to show things. This means things could go really, really up, and this excludes transportation. It's just materials who use petroleum as a basis. But what do you see in there?
Do you mean this chart?
Yeah, well, yeah.
This is just the WTI oil prices.
Yeah.
So only crude oil. Yeah, but as we've discussed, and I think I've maybe not said explicitly, the effect of this oil shock, I think the consensus right now is that it will largely be, temporary, and even the effect on oil prices, if we look at this chart on the future, the curve of the future prices, you can see that it will largely recover by the end of 2026. So a lot of this is going to be very front loaded, and in both Canada and the US, headline inflation will go up, but that's not enough for central banks to change their policy.
Okay.
If any revision, it'll be small. But like we've also mentioned, the case for the US and Canada is slightly different just because Canada, the Canadian economy relies on oil exports. That's about 5% of Canada's total GDP. And the US, people are more fearful of the contraction, the recession that could be caused by the oil shock, versus in Canada, I think this may not have been what your question was about directly, but the direction of, say, monetary policy would be more clear because things will move in the same direction. Like prices will go up, but demand will also go up. So it's easier to make the call for.
You actually answered the question I wasn't able to ask, and that's it. Is it more fearful or is it more the direct impact of materials?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, to your point, Eric, it's a good point to bring up, and it's important to look at it thoroughly because the price of crude oil impact pretty much every sector, right? From defense to transport to airline to everything. When it comes to construction, most people don't realize that there's three ways we are directly impacted. One of them is the price of material, as you pointed out, and Max had a slide there on polyethylene. That's a good example. There's many products that rely heavily on petroleum product. When the price of oil goes up, the price of these products goes up. Polyethylene has been going through the roof, especially in the Chinese market, which is the largest in the world. It is also true for cost of transportation, of course, which impact also grocery stores and retail. But in the case of construction, this is large amount of construction supply that need to get to the work site, and that price is further impacted, regardless of the production itself, by the cost of transportation. But the last one is also consumption of fuel on work site. It's especially true for civil that have a lot of heavy machinery, but also in case of many vertical projects where we do need diesel in generators and machinery and whatnot. So construction is stuck in the middle of these three realities. And really the impact on that is not so much the price itself, but the volatility of the price and the uncertainty of what the price is to come. So as contractors need to bid project, they don't know what the price of oil will be in a month, let alone in a year. So there's an uncertainty that you have to stomach there, and that's the challenge.
If I may add, there are clauses for fuel and stuff like that, but the PVC cement insulation system we don't have, and it costs mostly in the building sector. And we've seen suppliers starting to send letters in Quebec, and we were advised of that. So how high will they go? They just include transportation, or they just include that? And does it show in IPPI in March for these products? And I thought it was, but I was not sure.
So we have not been presenting the IPPI for a little while, and one of the reasons being the IPPI gives you the price of what they are at the Canadian factories versus some of these materials are not necessarily produced locally, and they may face broader market volatility. And like LP mentioned, the entire like polyethylene market, the biggest is all the way in China. So there isn't even like a Canadian benchmark, like not a good one for this type of purposes.
Good point.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Max. Thank you, Eric. Do we have any more questions from people in the room? I see Mike back on screen. Mike, go ahead.
So have you guys done much simulation related to potential cost impacts of Buy Canada? So April 13th, construction for public procurement in Ontario became Buy Ontario. And we ran some very quick simulations. I took, we do by building model type as opposed to something else. So we took a grade school, and we say that 52% of current materials consumed, and we do everything by division code, are native to Ontario. So I would expect there's not much of a price impact by Buy Ontario because, it's concrete, it's rebar, which is basically supplied domestically in Ontario to Ontario construction sites. We then estimated that another 28% is by the rest of Canada. And I think Buy Ontario has a layered sort of a buy from sourcing. So first it's Buy Ontario, then it's Buy Canada. And I think Buy Ontario is really actually exclusive to the United States. And so you end up with the other 20% largely coming from the rest of the world, which is probably not much different than it is now. But have you done much in the way of trying to assess is this just a whole bunch of kerfluffling of stuff that's not really going to change? We're just going to, in Ontario, you're going to end up with a certification on products that says, made in Ontario. But you guys got any senses? Because the worry is that there's going to be real cost impacts, right? And there may be on some product lines. But if you take like Ontario grade school, 52% is already domestic to Ontario. I would say there's an expectation for zero price impact due to Buy Ontario. But if all of a sudden you have to do Buy Canada overlaid on top of it, you may end up with demand from Quebec for Ontario product and any of that kind of stuff. Have you done any of that kind of work yet?
Max, want me to go first or?
Yeah, well, so nothing that's explicitly modeled because of how detailed these rules are. Like it's actually really hard to pinpoint what percentage of material is going to be exactly replaced and only by the by Canadian rules and not any other rules. Numerically, from my perspective, I think it's very hard to model that mathematically, and because the report needs to be published, so sometimes I tend to say like make more qualitative comments rather than nailing that down to a number.
Thank you, Max. The one thing I'll say though is to be fair, the simulation aspect is too much of a lift for a group like CCA. We don't have capacity to do that at scale. However, it is being done at the Government of Canada, and we've been working quite closely with Infrastructure Canada, who's currently doing extensive research and simulation on the different region and different product. The person leading this is Sean Keenan, who's the chief economist at HIC. Sean actually have compiled a survey that construction company and local association can fill out and provide feedback on what they see as local impact, the price they have in their bid and their procurement. This was sent through our CC newsletter, I think last month, and they've received hundreds and hundreds of feedback from construction companies in Canada. They're using this alongside with metrics that we have federally from StatCan primarily to try to evaluate that impact. The place where that analysis doesn't translate perfectly from Ontario to Canada is that I don't know enough about the Ontario policy to speak to that. But the federal policy is very narrow, but also have exclusions that are quite difficult to understand, or at least see how they will be applied. When I say it's narrow, it's really impact 3 products: steel, aluminum, and wood. So for example, cement would not really be a big impact because it's mostly local across all region, but it's not covered in policy at all at this point. This is, as they call it, an evergreen policy, so that could change in the future. Right now, the 3 products that are impacted, aluminum, steel, and wood, 2 of them are not overly concerning due to the regional availability. The big one is steel, and we have been having ongoing discussion with the steel producer. I'm meeting with them again Thursday to better understand Canadian capacity, Canadian diversity of product, what is not manufactured in Canada, if we can expect it to be manufactured in Canada in the future, and what the alternatives are. So we're still in the early process where the industry, both construction and manufacturing, are adapting to the policy. The policy itself is growing, and nobody really knows how these exclusion, there's 5 parameters that would allow to exclude product, will be applied, because this will require ministerial approval, which most likely will never come. Any more questions? I see we're at 12:20 here in the East, so if there's nothing else, I think we can wrap up early. Max, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the report. This will be made public in your inbox through our Plus newsletter. Feel free to share this with your member, with the public. And if you have any question about the report, we'll always be happy to take your call. My name is LP Champagne. I'm the Associate VP for Public Affairs Industry Practices. I was joined by Yung Hang Liu or Max from our economic team. Thank you all, and I'll see you next quarter.